video showing, does the brake fluid really disappear into this thing? Well, I think it does. That is what was in mine. Yuck. So you can get the rebuild kit for this, but I decided just to have Apple Hydraulics do it. I've got other projects to do. With a screwdriver, that gasket also goes down into here, but once I got it cut from around the outer lip, it loosened up a little bit, and then I took three really wide bladed screwdrivers and slowly pried this out. If you take just one screwdriver, you're going to break it. And I need to, in going through the instructions, I also have a new master cylinder. My old one was full of brake fluid. The seal had failed. It was wrecked. So the one setting, after installing it, I have to set the free play. There must be a small clearance called free play between the master cylinder and the activating push rod. So what they're talking about is, here's the booster here, and here's the master cylinder going out this way. There's the actuating rod that comes out, and then there's the end of the cup for the master cylinder. We have to set that in play here. How much gap is there? So, where were we here? This applies to both manual and power brakes. Absence of free play will cause the brakes to drag or lock up. Consult the service manual for the correct amount of free play. It wasn't in my service manual, but I did discover on the forum from Haynes manual, the Haynes manual says 0.001 to 0.016. So the question is, how do we measure that? How do we set that? How do we measure that gap? We need to set the gap between that push rod and the end of the cup in the master cylinder. And that needs to be anywhere from 1 to 16 thousandths per the Haynes manual. That's the only place I could find anything. Apple Hydraulics said to set it to 20. They said I could put a little bit of grease on the end of the control rod and then install this. And then if there's a little bit of transfer there, just the tiniest bit, then you're about right. Well, I wanted to see what it actually was. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure what's the actual distance to that cup, what's the actual protrusion of that rod, and calculate it, and then check it with the grease. Our first step in measuring that gap is just looking at how this thing is constructed. We have the flange and the flange of the master cylinder right here, and we have the end of the cup right here. What we need to do is measure from the edge of that flange to the edge of that cup. And we're going to do that by, I have to put you in my fancy tripod, which is a bench vise. We're going to do that with a digital caliper and a rule. And basically, this rule, I've already measured this rule, it's 1.004 inches. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the caliper and we're going to take this measurement right here, and we're going to check it 2 or 3 times. You might check it several different places, just so you make sure you're using it right. If you have things tipped, you'll get it wrong. So take that measurement and then come in and take this measurement. Now this is the old master cylinder. It's interesting. This old master cylinder is actually 1/8 of an inch. This cup is sitting out 1/8 of an inch more than the one that I installed in the car, the rebuilt one. But anyway, you take this measurement, you subtract that measurement, and you figure out, is it protruding, is it set in, and by how much. One way you can do this is you can set the caliper right here. Get this measurement right, 0, hit the 0 button on the caliper, and then adjust it here, and whatever your measurement is, that's your gap between the inside of that cup and that flange. Now I measured mine, and my gap between here and here was 0.014, 14 thousandths. Well, the Haynes says it needs to be between 0.001 and 0.016. So we can take a shortcut, and you can skip the whole rest of this video by noticing that if we set the actuator rod even with the flange, then we'll have a gap of 14 thousandths in spec. So what you could do is put a ruler across the brake booster and set the actuator rod flush with the ruler, and then you will have a gap of 14 thousandths. This is what I eventually did. But what if we had like my current master cylinder where this is protruding way up here? What if we need to actually set that gap, or 14 thousandths you want to go a little bit less, say you want to go 10 thousandths. So then we need to figure out, okay, how much further in do we need to move the actuator rod? How do we set this actuator rod with respect to this cup? How do we measure that? How do we set it? Okay, we have established that our gap here from the flange to the end of to the inside of the cup is 14 thousandths. It goes in 14 thousandths. So our cup to flange gap is 14 thousandths. What we want to do now is figure out, you set this gap to something different. How do we set that? Instead of 14 thousandths, say we wanted to set it to 10 thousandths or 1 thousandth at the very finest part of the specification in the Haynes manual. What we would do is we would take our current gap, which is 14 thousandths, and we would say, okay, what is our desired gap to the rod? Desired gap from the cup to rod. What's that desired gap? And we have, it would be, say we want 10 thousandths. So we subtract the current gap to the desired gap, and we know we have a 4 thousandths caliper setting that we want, after zeroing it out, that we need to adjust that gap, the current gap of what it is by, we need to adjust the caliper by 4 thousandths. So I did a math error on the previous one. I labeled it wrong. So we have 14 thousandths cup to flange gap. We want to make it a 10 thousandths gap. So we need a 4 thousandths adjusting rod length change. We need to change the adjusting rod by 4 thousandths. So which way do you move it? Well, here's our setup. Here's the booster. Here's the adjusting rod. Here's our rule. And here's our caliper, and here's the little thing sticking out of the caliper. So if you want to make the adjusting rod longer, if you want to increase the adjusting rod, you have to decrease the caliper. If you want to make the adjusting rod shorter, you have to make the caliper longer. So make sure that you get the motion the right way, or you will end up with double the gap that you intended. Okay, we're going to set up our caliper now to do the actual setting of the adjusting rod. So we've set our caliper to 1 thousandth over 1 inch, which is the width of our rule. And now, when we go to measure the adjusting rod, remember we're going to want to make our adjusting rod 4 thousandths longer. To decrease that gap, we want to make it 4 thousandths longer. So we have to move this part 4 thousandths this way. To move this 4 thousandths this way, we have to shorten this by 4 thousandths. So we need to take that, make that minus 4 thousandths of what that is. Easiest way to do that, rather than doing math, is to zero it out and then move it up till it's minus 4 thousandths. There we go. And then we're going to lock it up. And now this is set up so that I can go ahead and set that protruding rod. It's going to make the protruding rod 4 thousandths of an inch longer, decreasing our gap to 10 thousandths. Make sense? Now I'm having the same trouble as far as measuring the protrusion. I've got one hand filming and one hand doing this, so apologies. So this is not accurate. But what I'm doing here is I'm putting the steel rule against the hard up against the booster, and then taking the digital caliper and measuring against this rod. And I take 2 or 3 measurements at different times just to make sure I've got it right. So now I have the protrusion from where that flange sits, because the other measurement was against the flange, and the flange sits flat against this booster, so we have the same reference point. Now, I've seen I saw something in one of the forums or in the manuals or something from another car that has a booster, that you should do this with the engine running, because the vacuum will suck in the this adjuster rod. I started the car and measured it, and it didn't suck it in. I had to rev it up to 1500, maybe 2000 RPM for this to begin to suck in, and it sucked in quite a bit. So maybe 20,000, something like that. So my first attempt to adjust this post was I had this pair of vice grips and this ratchet, and I tried to get in there and hold it and so on, and that just didn't work. After a long time in thinking about it, and somebody on a forum pointing out, the simplest thing to do is to come in here and prop the brake pedal in. That pushes the rod out like this, and now I can get to this and hold this while I turn this. So now it's just a matter of turning it, putting it back in, pushing it all the way home, keep measuring it until I get my desired gap. Now, okay, it took me 4 or 5 tries, but I finally got it adjusted what I think is right, and then I extended it, 4 or 5 threads, put some blue Loctite on it, and then put it back in those same 4 or 5 turns or flats on the adjuster. But then that wasn't quite right. Still had to mess with it till I got it right, but I think I got it right. Now I need to bench bleed the master cylinder and test it. So I think we're done with the hard part. So I'm testing my new servo. What I'm doing, putting my foot on the brake and revving it, and as I rev it up, I can feel the brake pedal push against my foot, which says that the servo assist is helping. I hope that's helping enough at that level of vacuum. I'm not sure. I've never driven this car with a working servo, so but that's the test that I heard, is that check the push on the brake pedal and see if you can feel it as you rev. Just a part 2 to this bench